Good morning, everyone. Hare Krishna. Welcome to our Richard L. Thompson lecture series. If you are new to our bi-weekly program, this is where we go through Richard L. Thompson's book, covering them chapter by chapter with a different lecturer presenting on each chapter. So last week, 2 weeks ago, if you were here, Dvija Govinda presented on cosmography, Vedic Cosmography and Astronomy, Chapter 4, the vertical dimension. And today we are having a presentation on Chapter 5, the empirical case for the Vedic World System. And we are grateful to Krishna Kripa, also known as Christopher Beetle, for joining us and presenting on this chapter today. So Krishna Kripa has received a BA in computer science from Brown University in 1982. He took initiation from Satsvarupa Goswami in 1983, and he assisted Richard L. Thompson, also known as Sadaputa, in the production of books and videos on science and Krishna consciousness for 17 years. And he's been working with the BIHS since its inception in 2015. So welcome, Krishna Kripa. Thank you very much. And I see you already have your PowerPoint. You may go ahead.
Well, thank you very much. It's nice. It's an honor to be invited to do this, even though I'm not a real academic or a real presenter. I am fascinated by Sadaputa's material, and I was very happy to be working with him for so many years and being involved in the production of it. And because he's a great thinker, far ahead of his time. And so, Om Jnana Timarandasya Gyananjana Shalakaya Chakshunalitamina Tasmai Shri Gurave Namah. Namo Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthai Bhutale Shmite Bhakti Vedanta Swaminiti Namani Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pacharini Nipasishuni Vadi Pastatya Vishtami Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Vedagadadhar Shri Vasadi Gaur Bhakti Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 So this chapter is entitled The Empirical Case for the Vedic World System. So this is the outline. He has a little introduction, and he has 4 sections: UFOs, the link with traditional lore, the events at Fatima, and a conclusion. And so I just wanted to say a little bit about empirical evidence. It's also part of the Vedic world view. It's called pratyaksha in Sanskrit, and which basically means it's something that you can actually experience, and it's considered a bona fide way of acquiring knowledge, but not as not self-reliant and not complete as shabda or hearing from authority. The pratyaksha, or direct experience, and Anuman hypothesis are supposed to support Shabda, but they can't stand on their own because there's so many things that we actually can't perceive that actually exist. So the big point that Prabhupada makes in this chapter is, if this Vedic worldview is actually real, there are different grades of living entities and different realms, higher and lower than ourselves, different beings with different powers and abilities far exceeding our own, that there should be some evidence for it if it's actually a reality. And that's what he's going to discuss in this chapter. When I was thinking about it, I was reminded of one time I was at the BI building there in Alachua, and Sadaputa was talking with Bhakta Eddie, who is the guy who did all the wonderful 3D graphics for that Mysteries of the Sacred Universe video. And he later got initiated by Narayan Maharaj as Indupati Prabhu. So he was saying to Sadaputa, there's so many far out things in the Vedic worldview. How can you accept it? And without hesitation, Sadaputa Prabhu said, because it can explain so many things. And then when he said that, I just, from working with him in all these different books, I just thought about all these things that that it can accept it, that it can describe. It can describe ghosts. It can describe out-of-body experiences. It can describe past life memories. It can describe like worshiping of demigods, and it can describe different things like levitation and mystic powers and telepathy and all kinds of things, which the modern scientific worldview can't really fit in, and generally which people dismiss as not being real, although for centuries, people in all kinds of different cultures have been reporting such things. So that was striking to hear Sadaputa share his realization. So the first part is an overview. He talks about how in the previous 3 chapters, he presented this Vedic cosmology, and he described different higher dimensional worlds that exist, but we don't have complete access to. Excuse me, let me shut the door here because there's a Mridanga class in the adjacent room. I'm at ISKCON Brooklyn, by the way, which is a very, very dynamic place with a lot of things going on these days, which is very inspiring, actually. So let's see, go back to where I was here. Yeah, so there's these different living entities with different powers and different abilities to see more or less of the universe. And he talks about how this depends on the consciousness of the different beings, how much of the universe they can see. And Krishna, who's supremely conscious, is actually completely aware of everything, or is all-pervading. But otherwise, according to the karma of the living entities, they have more or less access to different parts of the universe. That's the whole theme. And that there's right now nearby, there exist beings that we can't actually perceive because we don't have the qualification to perceive them. So that's basically the introduction. And he talks, that's the first part of the introduction. Then he talks about how empirical evidence is faulty because of the 4 human defects. Usually I can only remember 3 of them. Let's see. There's imperfect senses, the tendency to make mistakes, the cheating propensity, and what's the other one? Imperfect senses, making mistakes. Oh, being illusioned is the other one. So, Yaksa, or empirical evidence, is fraught with these problems that are built in, unless you happen to be like Vyasadeva, who can see past, present, and future, unless you're especially empowered by Krishna to transcend these defects. So that's one reason it's not accepted. It's very easy to dismiss. You can just say, oh, they just have imperfect senses, or they're illusioned, and therefore you can reject any kind of empirical evidence you don't really like. And then other people have difficulty with this evidence because it contradicts fundamental assumptions of modern civilization. Like there's the consciousness is a product of matter, and that only things that we can perceive with our senses actually exist, and there can't be other things beyond what we can perceive. And so for these 2 reasons, because empirical evidence is defective anyway, and because this particular class of evidence is so completely contrary to the whole worldview, for those reasons, people dismiss the kind of evidence which Sadaputa is going to talk about in this chapter. However, there's a lot of evidence, and it fits in nicely with the worldview of the Vedic literature, which talks about different grades of being with different levels of consciousness and different supernatural powers that exist and have the ability to interact with human beings. And he talks about evidence coming from different categories: folklore and traditional worldviews, psychical phenomena, and UFOs. And he decides he's going to focus mostly on UFOs. Of course, he wrote this book, which back in he published it in '94, just after the Forbidden Archaeology. It was called Alien Identities, but he originally wanted to call it Parallels, because the theme is there's many parallels between the reports from modern UFO investigations and all kinds of accounts given in different Vedic literature like Ramayana and Mahabharata and Srimad Bhagavatam. And he was just amazed by all these different similarities, and he saw it as evidence supporting the Vedic worldview. So even within the Hare Krishna movement, even within BI, people criticized him because UFOs are not accepted. So why are you dealing with anything like that if you want us to be accepted? But he was interested in the Vedic worldview being accepted and there being empirical evidence for it. And this was very good empirical evidence. So he wasn't going to neglect the opportunity to investigate it just because of different people's beliefs or preconceptions. He thought it was opportunity to find more knowledge about reality. So he said that the evidence for these UFO experiences comes from 3 different groups of people: empirical investigators and debunkers and UFO cultists. And he mentions that it's hard to get an objective view of it because people have strong emotions, pro and con. I was one of the people who helped get reviews for that book, and I published the reviews on the website along with the description of the book. And so trying to inspire people to get it. And one of the viewers, they made a very amazing comment. They said that this is the most honest UFO book ever written. So that's an amazing statement. If you look, even on his shelf, he must have had like 30 UFO books. And our friend Yamaraj, who did a lot of the design and layout and was really a friend and really helped Sadaputa in many ways, he was really interested in UFOs, and he had a whole shelf of UFO books. So there's many UFO books out there, but these people said this is the most honest UFO book ever written, because most of the people are like true believers who bend all the evidence to show how it's a reality. And then there's the debunkers that try to discredit all the evidence to show that it's just a hoax. But Sadaputa was actually interested in what was actually reported and seen, and see if it actually corresponded to these different stories in the Mahabharata, Srimad Bhagavatam, and the Ramayana. So even though UFOs is controversial, and even though it's hard to actually understand it objectively because people try to bend the evidence in different directions, he will attempt to understand it because he wanted to provide support for this Vedic worldview. And at the same time, it shows how the modern scientific worldview is lacking in explanatory ability in many cases. So then he gets into talking about UFOs. He talks about a couple of cases. Talks about a case in Norfolk, Virginia, where you have 2 pilots. They used to be military pilots, and they see these 6 lights moving in a pattern, and then they do things like make a right angle turn, which you couldn't do physically as far as we know, and then another 2 join them, and then all of them blink on and blink off, and they estimate that they're moving at 12,000 miles per hour. And then he talks about another case, which is in Exeter, New Hampshire, and here different people who don't know each other in the same locale, they experience the same thing. It's like a glowing object as big as a house, and they report it to the police, and one policeman investigates and another policeman investigates, and they describe it in the same way. That's one of the things that makes the cases more credible, is if we have several witnesses who don't know each other and describing the thing in exactly the same way. And then he talks about different explanations that people give for these things. 1, illusions or hoaxes. 2, secret military vehicles. 3, alien spaceships from other planets. And 4, vehicles piloted by beings from a higher dimensional realm. So then he talks about different problems with those illusions or hoax cases. You're not, if you have many people who don't know each other viewing it, it's hard to show that it's an illusion or a hoax, because you have credible people saying the same thing about it. As far as the secret military vehicles, generally the military doesn't have technology that's that much far greater than the civilian aviation technology. Certainly they don't have things that can go 12,000 miles per hour and make right-hand turns without stopping. And then he talks about alien spaceships from other planets, and that couldn't be a possible explanation, because as far as the scientists and their theory goes, they say that human life evolved on this planet. So the idea that you could have intelligent life evolving on another planet in such a way that they would be able to interact with people from this planet and build spaceships that could transport them here, it's completely, the odds are like so insignificant that it's considered a virtual impossibility. So this idea that they're vehicles piloted by beings from a higher dimension seemed more reasonable to him. And then he talks about different classes of these UFO sightings. He talks about UFO cases with psychical attributes. He talks about a guy who he had this UFO encounter, and then where he saw his 2 discs that vanished, and he had a couple of things wrong with his body, and they healed. And after that, he had telepathic abilities that he didn't have before, and he would levitate, which he also didn't do before. So and then he made an interesting point about psychical phenomena, that usually in society you see as technology advances, you find less cases of psychical things, but the UFOs have both psychic ability and advanced technological ability. Like you have them, people being able to read minds and things like that, and but also build amazing flying crafts. So, but he mentions that in the Vedic literature, you also find beings that combine technology with mystic power. Talks about the demons such as Maya Danava have all these amazing abilities in terms of technology, but they also have all these mystic powers. So these kinds of beings are very much along the lines of what you see in these UFO cases. And he talks about the close encounter cases where the ETs or the extraterrestrials on the UFOs, they actually interact with humans. He talks about this story in Brazil where these 2 guys were in a car, and one of them was taken aboard the UFO and subject to a medical examination, and some blood was taken, and he didn't really remember what happened. He didn't remember how he got home and all these things. And then he talks about how in the Vedic tradition there's something called Vasita Siddhi, which is actually the ability to control people's minds, and has a little quote about how Prabhupada said that a yogi sometimes acquires this and uses it to control people's minds, take their money and go away. So in these cases where they're they're taken aboard a craft and is subject to examinations, obviously their mind was controlled and actually their body was controlled by these things. So he was saying that's consistent with the existence of this Vasita Siddhi. And then he talks about implications of the UFO reports for the theory of human evolution. He talks about how unlikely it is that humans evolved at all, and that same kind of thing would happen at another planet. And he quotes a couple of evolutionists as saying that it's completely unreasonable to think that an evolution of creatures like human beings that would have the ability to interact with human beings would spontaneously evolve on another planet. He talks about some more cases of, UFOs appearing and I'm not familiar with it. I just use the arrow keys, I guess. Talks about cases where the UFOs suddenly appear and disappear, and that which is common in different cases. There's one case where there's like they appeared from the radar and they disappeared from the radar at the same time. They appeared in sight and disappeared from sight, and then there was another electronic device that they used to measure, and it also appeared and disappeared on that. And then he finishes up with the UFOs and talks about other kinds of traditional lore where they have cases like UFOs. And he talks about a class of beings called the sylphs from medieval folklore that resemble different human-like beings, such as yakshas, kimpurusas, rakshasas, and they also had vimanas or flying creatures. He talks about shalvas. Vimana Shalva did some austerity to get a flying city practically that he could use to attack Dwarka, and how it had all kinds of different abilities. It would appear and disappear. It would appear as one and as many, and it would appear to move in erratic ways, very, very similar to many of these UFO cases. And then he talks about how in the Vedic worldview, there's different classes of beings that range from goodness to ignorance, and that if you look at the UFO cases, you see there's different levels of consciousness among the UFO beings. Some are definitely malevolent, and some seem more innocent, and some are actually seem benevolent. Like, for example, that one doctor, after his UFO experience, he was cured of two ailments he had, and he developed some additional paranormal abilities he didn't have before. So that was like a benediction. Whereas in some cases they're just harassed and subject to medical examinations and sort of traumatized. So that was a rather brief section. And then he talks about Fatima. So Fatima is a very amazing story. It's a city in Portugal where there was a supernatural phenomena in 1917 that was seen by thousands of people. And there were these three kids who on the 13th of the month, for 6 consecutive months, they had this vision of a divine being. They interpreted it as Mother Mary because they're in the Catholic tradition. And they would get different communications along the lines of spiritual instruction, and other things happened at the same time that other people could perceive. At one time, other people at the same time the event, the kids saw that this Mary, other people saw a glowing globe-shaped vehicle and a shower of rose petals that vanished upon touching the ground. So one of the kids requested this personality to perform a miracle so other people would actually believe in the phenomena. So they said, okay, on the 16th or the 13th of October, there'll be a miracle. So people were so faithful that such a thing was actually possible that 70,000 people gathered to see this miracle. And he quotes a couple descriptions from professors. There must be many, many accounts of this, but he quotes a couple which are pretty phenomenal. As if like a bolt from the blue, the clouds were wrenched apart, and the sun at its zenith appeared in all its splendor, began to revolve vertiginously on its axis like the most magnificent fire wheel that could be imagined, taking on all the colors of the rainbow and sending forth multicolored flashes of light, producing the most astounding effect. This sublime and incomparable spectacle, which was repeated 3 distinct times, lasted about 10 minutes. The immense multitude, overcome by the evidence of such a tremendous prodigy, threw themselves on their knees. So I think that one was from a seminary professor, so it had like more of a religious flair. The other was by a more secular professor. The sun's disk did not remain immobile. This was not the sparkling of the heavenly body, for it spun around on itself in a mad whirl, when suddenly a clamor was heard from the people. The sun, whirling, seemed to loosen itself from the firmament and advanced threateningly upon the earth as if to crush us with its huge fire weight. The sensation during those moments was terrible. So he talks about how some people would say that's caused by crowd hysteria, and that report came from an area 20 miles by 30 miles, which is a rather large area, and many individual people saw it who were separated by distances within that area. So that crowd hysteria wasn't a likely description. And it was interesting that there weren't any reports outside that. It seemed like a very big astronomical event, but there weren't any reports outside that 20 to 30 mile region. So he said it seems like it was a phenomenon created by an intelligent agency at a time announced in advance, where else coordinated hallucinations were arranged at that time in the minds of thousands, which is equally as astounding. Either way, it's not something that you could fit in modern science, but if you have human-like beings with the superior powers that are nearby, just in another dimension, it would be possible. So that brings us to the conclusion, really. He summarizes the Vedic worldview. Vedic literature maintains that we live in a hierarchically structured universe occupied by 400,000 species of human-like form and some 8 million non-human species. These living beings inhabit a graded system of worlds such as Bhumandala, which possess variegated geographical features. The thesis of this book is that these worlds are literally real, even though they are almost entirely inaccessible by ordinary human senses. We've tried to relate this idea to modern mathematical thought by describing the universe as a multi-dimensional system. Then he talks about how there's many beings like demigods are way up in the hierarchy, but it's not likely that we would relate to them as much as we would be more likely to relate to beings that are closer to us geographically and in terms of consciousness, like these different things like the yakshas and the rakshasas and the charanas and the vidyadhars and etc. And he says that such interactions could be expected to involve mystic powers, higher dimensional transformations, and remarkable flying machines, since these sorts of things are described in Vedic literature. And then he concludes by saying, he proposed that these ideas about what we might expect to see in the Vedic universe are consistent with the evidence provided by cyclical phenomena, UFO reports, folklore, and reports of miracles. This broad body of evidence is consistent with the Vedic world picture. However, none of this evidence is compatible with modern science, and all of it is rejected by the scientific community. He suggests that the Vedic worldview is broadly supported by empirical evidence, but this evidence can never be respectable until the Vedic worldview itself is restored to a respectable status. So that ends my summary of this this chapter. Does anybody have any questions, comments, or realizations, or any interesting insights you may have had when you read the chapter? Or
Hey, thank you, Krishna Kripa. We have, so for those of you who are online, you can raise a hand and then unmute yourself or pop a question into the chat. We have two either questions or comments here. Christina, and then who was it? Was it Hugo? Hugo, Dr. Hugo. And then we have Radha Mohan online.
Thank you very much, Krishna Kripa Prabhu. It's really nice to see you. Yeah. So, as I was listening to this and remembering reading this chapter. So, a long time ago, and in practically another lifetime, I had a very good friend who was a Google software engineer, and he worked on the technology behind Google Docs sharing, right? So his whole thing was capability-based security. And so he would explain to me, how they're working on Google Docs so that you can share your documents with people and give them certain kinds of access based on, their email address, or, if they're belonging to an organization, whatever certain qualifications. And it just kind of occurs to me that this is a very, very similar model, right? That like, if you're imagining, we all use Google Docs, right? But if you imagine that only the Google Docs you have access to are those are the only Google Docs that exist, right? That like only those URLs, right, that give you a Google Doc that you can see are the ones that exist, and everything else is, and there's just nothing else, right? That would be laughable, right? Like there's so many Google Docs out there, right? In practically infinite Google Docs. And some that you might actually be interested in, but you don't have access to them. Like that's just because that's kind of just the way it is. And so, but at the same time, the Google Doc that you do have access to and the Google Doc that you don't have access to, they might be right next to each other, and like a server somewhere or whatever, right? They might have almost the exact same URL. So so in the same way, right, there's like all these different parts of reality that we don't necessarily have access to, but to think that just because we can't, we don't see them, they're not there, and that they have to somehow be very far away from us, I think is sort of a Sadaputa is pointing out that that's sort of a similar folly. So that's my comment.
Yeah, that's a nice analogy. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, Sadaputa, he would use an analogy of like a Unix operating system where you have different things that you can access and different people in your group can access, and then there's some things that only the super user can access because they have different permissions like that. That's a similar idea.
We have Dr. Hugo.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Kripa Prabhu. It's good to see you.
Hare Krishna.
I'm appreciating this point of, I mean, it comes up again and again, but even in this presentation, that Sadaputa Prabhu was just like, he was a champion for objectivity, essentially. And I would say he's probably not seen like that, by everyone, for sure. Maybe a controversial figure in terms of what he was presenting in mathematics and physics. But who would be audacious enough to say yes, for UFOs to come from aliens that evolved on another planet is completely unreasonable. Therefore, evolution must not be true. I mean, that's an audacious claim. But when you actually look at it, it makes perfect sense, especially how you kind of presented it here today, and kind of speaking about UFO. I really appreciate the point at the beginning of the presentation that it's such an emotionally charged topic that it's hard to get objective information about it. Same with I don't know, human psychic phenomena, or there's different things like these. It's Yeah, it's dangerous whether you fall in the camp of believers or debunkers in these kinds of topics. In either case, you're kind of covering yourself over from the broader truth. And so I'm appreciating this mood that Sadaputa Prabhu is bringing out of, like, what's the actual truth? Like, let's look at the information and see what it's actually saying. We generally like to think that science does that, looks at information, assesses it critically, and then comes to a conclusion. But that's where we get into this discussion of scientism, right? The appearance of science. Whereas more oftentimes than the public would like to believe in the scientific community, there's lots of information that goes unchecked or is dismissed or is misinterpreted. And then we come upon conclusions that aren't actually grounded on reality, even though we're able to throw some sparse facts at them to make it seem like they are.
Yeah, all very nice points. Yeah, it reminds me of how that in the previous book that Judakarma and Sadaputa Prabhu wrote together, Forbidden Archaeology, they really deal with that idea that the controversial evidence just it disappears from view. Either people don't talk about it or they discredit it, and then it's no longer part of the picture. But it's the scientists, they pride themselves of having objective reality because they follow their scientific method. They have some hypothesis, they collect some evidence, and then if the evidence doesn't quite agree with their hypothesis, they adjust it so it fits the new evidence. And after some time of accumulating evidence and adjusting the hypothesis, they get a hypothesis that works for all the evidence. But if they're so attached to their present hypothesis that they reject evidence that it's not consistent with it, then they no longer are coming up with objective knowledge. Rather, they're revealing that they have blind faith in a hypothesis that has evidence against it. So they're actually, and they think they're themselves better than the religionists because the religionists just have some faith in some scripture. That scripture may be true or may not be true, but they have a blind faith in a hypothesis that has evidence against it, and therefore Prabhupada called them fools and rascals because they're not even following their own method, and they're claiming to be superior to other people who have a different way of acquiring knowledge that could very well be true, and which we are considering to be true, and which actually has a lot of empirical evidence supporting it, if you actually are willing to look at all the evidence out there. Any other interesting points of discussion?
Radha Mohan.
Oh,
and
yeah,
one
please
second.
go ahead.
Yes, we have Radha Mohan, and then we have another one here on this end. Go ahead, Radha Mohan.
Hare Krishna, Haribol to everyone. Very interesting topic. I think, the 20th and 21st century kind of UFO ufology circles, we read and we hear a lot about the grey aliens. These are the guys of a demoniac, Asuric quality, if we actually read into them.
Right. Yeah.
With large heads, almond-shaped eyes, responsible for most of the abductions. And obviously, we're talking about lower planet kind of category here. And it would seem that it kind of fits in, doesn't it, to the idea we're in the Kali Yuga, that the Earth is more likely to attract people from the higher planets than the lower planets. Whereas we look to the other yugas and Mahabharata period and before, where there's that tendency to attract more kind of higher beings, but now we're perhaps karmically or whatever. I'm trying to fit this in with the modern ufology with the Bhagavatam, of course, where now we're attracting people from of a lower nature. But when it comes to the grey aliens, which appear to be by far the most frequent characters that appear in these circles, the story of Betty and Barney Hill, for example, which appears actually in Alien Identities, incidentally.
Yeah, yeah,
The most famous grey alien story, which many others have appeared to have been replicated or have happened to others as well, depending on your viewpoint. But how do the grey aliens fit into the Puranas, the Bible terms? What kind of planet are they from? I wondered if anyone had any thoughts about that. Over to you, Krishna Kripa.
Characteristics a little bit for not all of us. When I proofread that book and I worked on the different aspects of it, but somehow or other, it wasn't my Yamaraj like knew in detail about all the different classes of aliens, but they never really stuck in my mind. So if you could perhaps describe their characteristics briefly for us who are not really up on the UFO literature or who've forgotten it due to the time factor.
You're asking me to describe the greys? Is that
Yeah.
what you're saying? Okay. I mean, okay. Basically, these are guys that are 3 or 4 foot tall in general, very large heads, no ears or nose, tiny mouths, large, staring owl-like almond-shaped eyes. I think it's something like responsible for or connected to 90% of modern abduction stories, particularly in America, and the whole thing about Roswell as well. Those were the grey types. A lot of stories in connection. I'm not saying this is necessarily all true, but I'm just saying that in the the modern ufology circles, Area 51 as well has that connection with the greys, and Dulce base as well. And these are guys of a demoniac quality, very highly scientifically advanced, doing experiments, genetic experiments on humans to try to create a hybrid between humans and themselves as a way of living on the earth, because they're so spiritually redundant but so scientifically advanced that the way they practically live in a laboratory, where that's the only way they can actually reproduce and survive is by connecting with other species genetically in some way, in a way that perhaps we don't understand very well. But these are the kind of from the books I've read anyway, the kind of conclusions that the authors have come up with, that they actually are almost like lost souls who found these bodies that we call the greys, that are trying to find a home. Maybe they destroyed their own, millennia ago in some way. But this is quite a popular thing if you actually read into the right kind of books. However, to connect that with the Vedas is sometimes quite challenging, unless they are some kind of connected to the Naga race in some way. I mean, to try and connect it in that way. But that's what I have to say. That they're usually very slim, long, pointy fingers, proportionally with their body, usually without emotions. And there are some writers that have even said they're actually androids of the reptilian, the Nagas. They're not actually even living beings, but rather robots that are so scientifically advanced they are biological by our biological robots, by our understanding.
Wow.
Yeah. Anyway, that's the greys in a nutshell.
Okay, so now everybody knows.
So, this is the greys in a nutshell, is according to people they picked up and then reported it. I mean, we don't really know who or what they are. It's sort of like asking a hamster in some scientific lab, could you please describe what the human beings do? I mean, the kind of people that the hamster's seeing in that lab is a small section. Another thing to keep in mind is we also have these reports like the Fatima incident, and particularly the higher beings that we identify in the Vedic corpus. That if you're using science fiction language, they shapeshift. They don't need to present themselves as, they can present themselves however they want. And if they don't really want to make a scene, I mean, they just blend in. I mean, I remember there's a favorite story from my favorite story. He was talking about they were out on, or somebody, maybe just told it in Boston, but they're out in Harinam and they were broke, and this is early whatever days, and some real tall kind of guy who just kind of just walked up and gave him $150 to make the rent and walked off, and he got this impression, who knows who he was. He just kind of walked up and gave him the cash, and day was saved. So higher beings certainly can shift around. These grays, how they fit into a Vedic description, who knows? They're certainly technologically inclined. You know, I would be careful about making a definitive analysis of who they are and what they could be. It could really be anything. They certainly seem to be technologically inclined, and what their purpose is. You know, it's all evidence that's been reported. You know, it's like asking that hamster, you know, what do you think of the political situation in Washington these days? You know, I mean, how much are they going to access? So be careful about that. One thing is, I remember first time I went to the Science Museum in Boston, I was a little toddler, or no, I was a little bigger than that, maybe 7 or maybe 8. My dad brought me to the Science Museum in Boston, and we went to the planetary show, and they were talking about aliens, and they would talk about that Exeter, you know, the Exeter incident with the hills, and talk
Wow.
about the 47 thing. So, you know, I don't know, it brings back memories. I mean, my dad was kind of an alien, you know. No.
Are you a hybrid?
I don't know. Yeah. Yeah. Still trying to figure it out, man.
There's also a question or comment here by Rishabh Deva.
Yeah.
Yes.
No.
go ahead.
Prabhu, I just had a small, observation to make. Overall, it was a very nice and interesting talk. And you actually mentioned that how depending on how advanced we are, depending on how advanced our consciousness is, one is able to view the external world. So and it just occurred to me that like an ant in this room, where we are. So if you have an ant in this room, and if I'm in this room, I'm actually able to understand that I'm in this room, which is a part of the Bhaktivedanta Institute, which is in Alachua, which is in America. But an ant has absolutely no idea about that. It's only just to see some food there, and it has no idea about it at all. So that's a very obvious example of that. And the other observation I had was that you mentioned about biases which science has, like for example in mathematics, if you see, they have this idea of a point. The point has no height, no width, no length, etc. But the whole mathematics is actually based upon that point. A line is like infinite set of points, and then you have a plane, which is again an infinite set of lines. So they actually accuse us of having axioms and like a priori as assumptions, but science also has these. So it's just a matter of if you have faith or not with that, whether if you have faith in your source of information or not. That's all I have to say. That's a small observation.
Krishna Kripa, you're muted.
I'm just hearing the end of what you had to say, because my computer, although it was plugged in, the cable was loose and it crashed.
Oh, okay.
But unfortunately, I didn't notice it until it was too late.
It was pretty mind blowing though.
Say again?
It was pretty mind-blowing, his explanation.
He was saying everything you were saying, only better.
That wouldn't be a surprise. I didn't do well on my
No, you did
group one
fine.
SATs. I just done my math.
Do we have any other comments or questions?
I feel bad that nobody said anything about the grays, and we sort of like sort of that
Just to put a plug in, because we're doing these books in the order that they were published, our next book after this, we complete this series, is Parallels. That
No, we may change the order.
Okay,
For,
we may change
yeah,
it.
we may change the
Well,
order.
it's happening at some point. And
Yes,
that's
it
a
will
whole
definitely.
In a parallel
In a
universe.
parallel universe, it's already happening. Yes, Prishni has a comment.
I really also like Christina's discussion on different access to Google Docs as an analogy. We had a talk a year and a half ago maybe, and I think you may have been there, Krishna Kripa, given by Namamrita, who's an airplane pilot with Southwest. He's also the son of Yogeshwar, I think many of you know. And he was giving this amazing description of controlled space. So we don't know about that here on this earth because we can walk, most places, but airplane pilots have very strong restrictions on space access depending on what height they are above the earth, and practically no restrictions when they're very, very close. But as they get up, there's more restrictions, which is really interesting. And so I thought, wow, that sounds kind of familiar. So I said, what happens if inadvertently, as a pilot, you cross through that space? And he gave a description that was really kind of scary. He said, within seconds, you will have in America, you will have 2 Air Force planes, one on each side of you, and they tilt their wings like this. And if within a few very short seconds or minutes, you don't immediately turn out to leave the space, you will be shot down.
Wow.
So it's just this idea of access is not foreign to us actually at all. And it happens in all different ways. And he experiences this, he said, all the time. And he also mentioned that the access, it's not necessarily set up in a rigid way. They have to check constantly to see how these different spaces are controlled at different times because of different things, events that are happening. They will lose access here because, for instance, if a president is traveling, then you lose all kinds of access. You can't get near that plane, because of access issues. So anyway, just another analogy that ties in.
I'm glad Google Docs isn't like that.
Yeah, it seems the aliens are a lot mellower too. They don't really shoot.
Oh, yeah.
There is, in the congressional hearings, there was an example raised that they did shoot down some Russian jets that were trying to actually missile them. And then they took control of their, allegedly, their central control thing. But you don't hear them harassing too much that way, overtly. But that Google Docs analogy was really good because like Krishna Kripa says, Sadaputa used certain examples like Unix or another one I heard is accessing a university computer system. Students have a certain level of access. The teacher has more, department head has more, university administrators have more. But the Google Docs is something everybody uses now.
Yeah.
So it's real immediate.
Did anybody have any ideas of what the grays correspond to in the 400,000 human life forms?
Well, it's there's just all kinds of different human forms. Forms that facilitate human consciousness or something that resembles human consciousness. I don't know. I think Krishna Bhajan has an idea.
Right, just off the top of my head, speculation. I don't know if Sadaputa probably suggested it, but if the subterranean heavenly planets, according to the Bhagavatam, they have the technology to make vimanas, right? So, am I correct there? Is that right? They have vimanas.
Well,
subterranean. Isn't Maya Danava from there?
Yeah, I think you're right
Okay.
there.
Okay, so high level of technology, able to create kind of illusions in, what to us are illusions by, technological manipulation. And whoever it was suggested that Radhika Mohan, that the Greys might be even biological robots. So the idea of a biological technological android is not so far-fetched, really, because that's what we're already sitting around in. It's, scientists are, ultimately they're trying to recreate this, right? It's that their God complexes. So in an advanced, we've already got like, these kind of crude androids that look like people and tell us that they're not a threat to our existence. And so, from a society that's far more advanced, they could be synthetic life forms that could also, just like this is actually a synthetic life form. It's just very cleverly made, right? And so the soul is able to enter into this.
But what difference would that make? I mean, these are synthetic life forms. It's not like we're human beings,
No, we're still synthetic.
Huh?
Lord
this is just for
cronies.
yantra. It's true. Yeah. No, it's just for yantra.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in theory, as secondary creators, maybe you can make some yantra and a jiva could enter it as one.
Yeah.
I mean, these are just machines, very complex machines.
So that would be my suggestion, is that they're from the subterranean heavenly planets with all their super, advanced technology.
Yeah, the evidence seems to suggest that, because you don't hear the higher beings enamored by that style of finessing the material energy, through more mechanical, so the evidence suggests maybe something of that nature, but then, who knows, we're just kind of, I mean, they're interesting things to explore, ways to look at it.
That's the mode of ignorance is more prominent in the age of Kali. So you get the people are doing genetic experiments on human beings, and people have bad karma, so they have the karma of being somebody who's genetic experiments done on them.
We're not really entirely clear what they're doing or why they're doing it. I mean, if they're so advanced and everything, why are they wasting time here? I mean, so they're doing something that, suggests some kind of experiments. So I mean, they could be doing anything. We really, suggest, who knows? I mean, they're interesting ideas. I'd be careful not to read too much into it.
You don't really have so much description of all the different, classes of beings and the different qualities and abilities. So you can't really see what they correspond to. They have a demoniac tendency.
Well, they're doing technologies, and that tends to be, symptomatic of people a little bit, a certain approach to material energy. I wouldn't, are all Russians demonic, or all Americans demonic, or all Eskimos demonic? I mean, I wouldn't, I'd be careful. Yes. Oh yeah. Oh, one last thing. I'm sorry. I mean, when you don't hear those kind of descriptions in the higher realms where they're like, hey, let's build a Ferrari or something, it's like more of a swan airplane mode. But I'm sorry.
Three things I want to say. One is Sadaputa mentions, and I don't know where, probably in Aliens, that of the 400,000 human species that are mentioned in the Puranas, they only have descriptions of 18.
Wow, that's interesting.
Like that. So, there just isn't, as you're saying, there just isn't a whole lot of description of that.
Yeah, if they ain't given too many Bhagavatam classes, what do they need to talk about in the Bhagavatam for?
Then another thing that Prabhupada has said is that basically those of us, earthlings, basically deal only with the lowest three levels of the hierarchy, Bhu, Bhuvar, and Swar. So Swargaloka is, Prabhupada said after that we just forget it. We don't have any dealings. So we're really just kind of looking at those lower levels. And the that Luvar, that what you were mentioning, were all those Upadevas, all the Rakshas, Yakshas, Kinnaras, Gandharvas. That's extremely close to Earth. And so Sadaputa suggests that almost all of that interaction is with places that are inherently very close. And of course, the subterranean heavenly planets are, in one sense, in the Earth, so they're the closest. And then you have the those other ones. Other than that, there's no reason to think that there's these aren't people from Tapaloka coming in spaceships to do experiments, like the Kumaras. It's not of that nature.
And of course, they could be shape-shifting.
Yes, absolutely. Well, they do.
Yeah.
Yes,
So, if you're going, if you're an amoeba on the moon and you see, Lance Armstrong, we'll put it with Neil, is in that wacky suit, who knows what the technologies are involved here. But the subterranean heavenly planets, I can't say it, but because everything's heavenly, you think they'd look a little bit perhaps more attractive than those gray dudes. But who knows? Beauty's in the eye of the beholder.
Yes.
That's good. Hugo?
It's kind of a half-formed thought, but based on the discussion that's happening now, it's kind of coming back to this idea that, like, what's the purpose of the Bhagavatam? The purpose of the Bhagavatam: cultivate people to develop love of Godhead, right? And so, like we said, the 18 out of the 400,000 species that we have description of, let alone the other 8 million species. Like, what else is out there? We see some on this earth, but yeah. So the question that comes to my mind is, if we are fundamentally organizing ourselves around texts, literatures that are centered around developing the jiva's relationship with God, like, where is the point where we can, right, like, no longer kind of try and relate it to like a scientific, empirical, objective worldview?
There could be areas of overlap, but it's not like we have to go point by point and therefore we're validated, If there's areas of overlap, it's interesting and it could help certain people, to enter into the discussion. I don't think we need point by point validation.
Oh man, but when we get to the Maya book, it's gonna be great.
Yeah, no, then there's more tools in the Maya and parallels. Yeah, no, there's a lot more tools there. How to Satsvarupa was a real pioneer.
Yeah.
A lot of the philosophy mind we're talking about will come out in the Maya book. Right now we're just looking at, there's some curiosity, as I call this chapter. Sadaputa is raising a curiosity, no answers, just a curiosity. In alien identities or parallels, the curiosity gets much deeper because there's too many curiosity points to be just a coincidence. Again, not much of a conclusion. When we get in the Maya book, then of course it's not concerned so much with the aliens or whatever, but it gets into the philosophical points behind it that are significant. And I think that's going to be a nice culmination for a lot of what we're doing here in this book club, getting to, well, what does it mean? Where does it go? Why is this even important? Why bother with this? And Sadaputa thought a lot about why bother with topics. It wasn't just because they're curious or fun, or in the case of UFOs, titillating even. I mean, when Sadaputa, one of his great frustrations when he went on lecture tours is he was 100 times more invited to speak about UFOs than mechanistic science. And it was one of his, said to me, well, this is frustrating. Every UFO convention wants me to give a talk, but who cares about mechanistic? So, it was one of the frustrations.
And he found those, I'm so sorry. He found those UFO conventions a little frustrating. There wasn't much intellectual engagement.
No, I went to some of those with him.
Yeah.
And I swear, if people who don't, have doubts about abduction, go to a UFO convention, because you got to be convinced these people had to have been abducted. Because they're so strange. You can't help but think, this is the evidence that we need. They're here.
Yeah, that parallels.
Been returned.
We'll shut up. I swear to God, I will shut. But parallels was the original title, and then alien identities was used because it would reach a
It was
market.
titillating. His
Yeah.
publisher wanted that.
And then the parallels. I mean, that was the whole point of the book. There's parallels between these ancient traditions and their accounts, and these things that seem to be coming up quite a lot, particularly since World War II. That there's some correspondence and parallels that you could, maybe find an entrance to look at it.
True.
Yeah.
Very true.
And my stance is and continues to be that the more advanced we become in technology, especially computer science and things like virtual reality, the more extremely applicable the Bhagavatam will become.
Yeah.
A very important point, Christine.
Another way to look at it is if we get rid of Google, then maybe the aliens will go away. Okay.
Hey, do we have any other questions, any other concerns
I don't see any hands
about
raised.
about the grays? Okay. Krishna Kripa, thank you. I have a small question. You started off speaking about basically how do we know something, and I'm wondering if modern science acknowledges that empirical evidence is faulty due to those four defects.
Yep.
And also, I think it was Rishabh Dev that was speaking about the biases. If emotional response, this was what was mentioned at the beginning, if emotional response is part of the processing the evidence and creates biases, can you ever extricate the person from, can you ever really have something that's truly objective because no one is a blank slate, I think. And does modern science account for that?
Yes. But
Well, I hopefully, I don't think I'm competent to answer those. But I think other people may, but I think it's common knowledge that that empirical evidence there is imperfection there, and that's why, like in that archaeology book, people were always finding fault with the evidence in different ways, and that's how they could eliminate. They would, because they're biased, they would find all the faults in the evidence that was against the theory, and they wouldn't find the same faults in the evidence that was for the theory. So it is a problem. I guess Krishna is the ultimate objective authority, really, because he's seeing everything as it is and describing it as it is. And if somebody was actually perfectly in tune with Krishna, they could actually see how it is.
Yeah, I would say that his is the only objective view, and the actual objective view that is from the Lord.
Seven opulence.
yeah, no, Sadaputa is really gifted. I mean, I think this is a captive audience for that, but definitely was. But intellectually, they will acknowledge that. Hence, peer review and testing and this and that. No. But emotionally, as human beings, they might be about as advanced. Some of them might be about as advanced as those dudes who got abducted at those alien conventions. Some of them are true believers, But intellectually, they will acknowledge it, and of course, not all scientists are grays necessarily. Some of them aren't.
Hey, thanks, DTD. Okay, thank you. Unless there is anything else, we will close here. We'll be back in 2 weeks for the following chapter 6, that is Modern Astrophysics and the Vedic Perspective. That's going to be presented by Doug Watson, who has a PhD in physics from Vanderbilt University.
I make another announcement. We are doing this every other week. Soon, it's not established when yet, we will have the Druta Karma book club, and he will be personally presenting each chapter of I'm not sure, the hidden history or forbidden archaeology. Probably, well, he has 3 books. We're still picking which one. It may be his last one, that he'll be presenting each week, the Druta Karma book club. So every week we'll have it. With our preparation for the cosmology conference, we have to be a little cautious not to overload our schedule. So we're still working out when that will begin, but you all will hear about it, and that will be a most intellectually exciting book club.
Great, thank you, VT. So stay
Thank
tuned.
you. It's nice to hear about that.
Yes, thank you all very much. Krishna Kripa,
Thank you so much.
thank you again for presenting this today.
You're welcome, and I'll try to adjust my schedule so I can participate in the ones that I don't present, which I haven't had a good. I know the Philly Raphael Trust starts at noon on the 23rd, but between 11 and 12, I might be able to tune in.
Great. Nice to see you. Thank you everyone for your attendance, your questions and your comments. See you in 2 weeks. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna.